Hello, you wonderful people, and welcome to another episode of Not Too Comic Book. This being a show, we're talking about TV shows that are adaptations of comic books. For today's episode, I'm going to talk about the latest episode of Doom Patrol. Very interesting episode. A lot of stuff to kind of break down. It's interesting because this episode, a big part of it is obviously like the whole Cliff and Jane situation. I like that, like, he woke up because obviously he was having a dream of Clara, and he wakes up and Jane's there, but it's not Jane. She switches over to Hammerhead and gets super pissed and everything, and it was like, don't touch me. We kind of end up finding out later on what that was all about, and it is kind of interesting. It's because it did seem like when Jane, like after Paraguay last episode, it did seem like Jane was kind of acting a little weird towards Cliff. She's like, yeah, it's nothing, it's fine. And it's like, oh, okay, now we kind of understand. Like for Hammerhead, it's like apparently Jane's kind of going away just because I guess after everything with Fuchs last episode, kind of questioning everything about herself, because I think for her it's like, maybe on some level, Jane probably thought like, hey, like, you know, for her, it's like everything's kind of always worked and stuff like that. And I think maybe even the thought that maybe, hey, I'm not the, you know, maybe that I am the center of Jane, that I am the real one, that all the others are personalities, but maybe finding out that maybe she's another one as well. I guess it kind of makes you kind of have a bit of an existential crisis. I mean, even if that isn't not the case, she's kind of having an existential crisis because it kind of put it all in perspective. Because I think, you know, she's always been okay with just like the craziness of it all, but I think him suggesting potential control and stuff like that, I don't know, it just seems like it kind of made her spiral a little bit. And I guess what kind of threw her off center was the whole seeing Cliff like that, because for her it scared her, because she's like, oh, Cliff's covered in blood. Because, you know, one of the things she associates with Cliff was that moment, you know, in the second episode where he was nice to her and everything. She kind of saw the softer side of him, and to see him kind of like covered in blood and stuff like that, she kind of looks at him like a monster. And even Hammerhead was like, yeah, at the very least, I may be kind of what you say, like I'm calling myself Hammerhead, I'm doing all this stuff, but it's like, at least I exist for a reason. What is your excuse? Like, because the thing is, like, she was concocted to be that. That's who she represents. That's who she's supposed to be. It was like, what is your excuse, Cliff? You're supposed to just be a person, and you went on a killing spree like that, you know? A bloody and messy killing spree. So it's just kind of interesting, because obviously it's like how Jane sees him versus also how he sees himself. Because even he was like, what the hell? Like, even he was shocked by what he did. So that's the thing of like, it's like, it begs the question of like, is that, once again, I brought that up in the previous episode too, is that just him being a robot, or is that something that was always there, that just his current situation of being a robot just kind of set that all in motion? But this is all about a boy named Elliot who's believed himself to be like, oh, I'm going to be the one to save the world. But it turns lo and behold, his parents are part of this cult about this unwritten book, which is basically supposed to be like the word of God. And it's supposed to release this eye that's going to basically lead to the end of the world. So that's interesting. Poor Elliot, because he went most of his life thinking like, oh, I'm going to save the world, until his like 18th birthday. His dad was like, okay, your mom's lied. Get out of here. You're not saving the world. You're ending it. And his mom proceeded to slit his dad's throat. It's like, jeez. Then we get introduced to Kipling, played by Mark Sheppard, which is awesome. If you don't know, like, one of the things Mark Sheppard is best known for is playing Crowley on Supernatural. So I was like, hey, that's so awesome. I like Kipling's character. I guess he's supposed to, like, you know, he practices dark magic and stuff like that. He's like, he's one of the, it's interesting because he kind of he seems like he's a Constantine type. Cause like, they wouldn't do, like, he wouldn't be Constantine, would he? I mean, just because, like, the whole, like, Constantine's already kind of in circulation currently with, like, Arrowverse and stuff like that, so I figured they wouldn't do that, but I guess he's kind of in that same realm. To be fair, I'm not that familiar with, like, the more magical side of the DC universe. I've always talked about that. My only experience is, like, Zatanna. I guess you can count Damien Dark, but his whole situation comes from a totem, but I guess that still counts as magic. So him, Constantine, and I guess Dr. Fate, but Dr. Fate's situation, it's magic, but isn't that more on a cosmic level? Either way. So I get they're the only people with magic I'm really that familiar with at all, you know, so. But I guess, you know, he's kind of part of that realm of people as well. It's interesting too, because it brings up an interesting thing about this episode too, in the regards of, like, obviously, like, there's a disconnect between him and Vic, in the sense of Vic is kind of like, no, you're up here suggesting we kill Elliot because Elliot will be the book that needs to be read because he's a literal book. I was wondering what all that writing on his body was about. It's like, oh yeah, they were literally completing the book, the unwritten book. And so, Kip is all about killing him, but Vic's like, no, Niles, why do you claim to know Niles? The fact of the matter is that Niles I've known since I was 6 years old would never side with you doing this. But for him, it's like, that's the Niles kind of like the uncle who's always going to pat you on the back for being, oh, great job, and kind of give you good advice. But it's like the Niles I know is willing to do whatever it takes for the greater good, essentially, whatever sacrifices have to be made, So obviously there's a disparity there because not all of them have been around long enough to kind of know Niles, because he does obviously have a past, because we see with the whole Fook situation and him stealing something from Fook, but we don't know what it is, So there's that aspect of it, of like, yeah, there's definitely more about the chief that they don't know about. And there's also this other element of the episode I thought was kind of interesting too, is the whole Vic and Rita situation. Like, ever since last episode, Vic's like, yeah, you've kind of made it clear you don't want to be a part of this, because Rita's like, well, I'm being left out of this. I also love that the fact is, it's like, oh, how many known dimensions? It's 37. So I was like, I guess we're not going with the whole, well, because I don't know if, that's what I've always treated dimensions as, kind of like, the multiverse thing, but I guess they're setting it, I would assume so, because they didn't go to the point of being like, oh yeah, the multiverse. They were just kind of like, oh, there's 37 known dimensions. I would assume that it's hard to say, I'm assuming that's supposed to be the multiverse, but I guess in my head, when they use dimensions, it kind of makes me feel like they're not referring to the multiverse, but they have to be, which is interesting. I wonder why they chose that specific number. Like, I guess it's kind of distinguish itself, because I feel like when it comes to like stuff, is usually kind of like, oh yeah, we'll throw out 52, just because that's the magical DC number and stuff like that, So I was like, I figured as much, but it's like, why 37 specifically? I guess that's supposed to just represent the fact it's because there is so much they still don't know, and maybe that's something we'll expand upon across all of this continuity, that including this and Titans, the whole multiverse situation. So maybe that's why they're leaving room for stuff to grow and be added on later on. I don't know. Either way. But Vic kept leaving Rita out of everything. And it's understandable, because, Vic is kind of like, no, this is the team. Obviously, we all want to do this. You don't want to be a part of this? Oh, we'll find something else, for you to do. Obviously, Rita kind of feels pissed off, because, this is as much her home. So if they're getting involved with stuff, she wants to be a part of it. I think what pissed her off the most is, Vic is, making decisions for her, being like, oh, obviously, you said this and that, so obviously, you'll have to be a part of it and stuff. It's because he's essentially making decisions for her. It's like, no, I can make my own decisions. Let me kind of choose. Because for her main thing is, she feels like you're so intent on being the hero, that you're kind of pushing that mantle onto us. We don't want to be the hero. We're not the heroes. Maybe Larry isn't one. Maybe the thing inside of him is one. That's what, Vic is kind of saying. But you have Rita kind of being like, well, what if the thing inside of him is insane? I also love it too, because it's like, Cliff has Jane, but Rita's like, who do I have? You didn't even have my back in there. Larry's like, the fact of the matter is, I don't want to get involved in this either, but this thing inside of me won't quit, And every time he wakes up, he ends up finding himself in front of videotapes of his conversations with Niles. And he's like, I'm not about to hear this stuff. But it turns out all of it was, Niles trying to stress him to be like, okay, get the creature out. So he actually tried communicating with the creature, and he says, what makes it so that you're able to live inside of Larry? And it's like torture. So I can only assume, just based on what that's saying, it's because this thing feeds off Larry's agony. I don't think it feeds off the fact is that Larry tortures himself, all that pain and grief, what kind of, all that pain he's holding, all that regret he has and stuff, him constantly torturing himself for all the mistakes he made, that's what's keeping the creature around. If he ever wants to probably be potentially freed of it, he probably would have to feel not guilty anymore. But I think because he's constantly I don't know, maybe it's, there's probably a distinction between just guilt and torture. Probably not. Maybe there isn't that much of a line, because I was about to say, maybe if he stops feeling guilty, maybe it'll go away, but maybe it doesn't necessarily have to just be guilt. Maybe it's not just about torturing yourself, it's about taking that guilt and accepting it. Maybe when that's all said and done, the creature will leave potentially. I don't know. It's still interesting how it's still tied to him in a sense of every time it leaves, he kind of shuts down. I guess, because it's the only thing I guess his body is naturally dead, and it's just the only thing keeping it animated, interestingly enough. Once again, that's how I'm kind of chalking it up and stuff like that, so. But Larry kind of hears that, and also finds out there's a way to kind of communicate with this thing. It's like a device that basically turns energy into frequency. Obviously it was kind of breaking, but who's to say that, the chief didn't fix it later on at some point in time, so. You know what's also kind of an interesting thing about this episode, and I thought was kind of pretty neat, is the whole like, oh, Vic is representing the science and you have Kip representing the magic. Because to me, it's one of those things where I think I let that slip my mind from time to time, that the DC universe is made up of both science fiction and magic. I kind of forget that, and just kind of seeing everything kind of operate in the same. I mean, to be fair, Legends of Tomorrow is heavily playing with that, because obviously like this season is like magic and science fiction, because you're time traveling, but you also got Constantine and all these mythical creatures and stuff like that. But it's just, I feel like it's something I don't feel like I see that often, because a lot of the stuff that pops up, I guess I always chalk up kind of more science fictional side of things, where it'd be like the Green Lanterns. That's kind of borderlining magic, but that's like space magic, I mean, Wonder Woman tackles more on the magical side of things with gods and stuff like that. But, that's because I wasn't that familiar with Wonder Woman's backstory, and just like the mascara and just her backstory just being a god and everything, So it's just interesting. Like I said, just in my head, it's just kind of interesting to kind of see it literally on screen at the same time to remind you. It's like, yeah, don't forget there's magic and science fiction in this universe. I don't know. It's just for me. I'm sure not everyone has that thing, but it just kind of catches me from time to time, and it's something that kind of crosses my mind. It was pretty badass seeing Vic kind of pull out the cannon and everything. I love that they're going up against those things, what they're called, I forgot what they're called, but basically they're made up of dead flesh and unsent letters. That's interesting. And then Kip, being the dick that he is, ends up kind of throwing Vic to the enemy so he can keep them distracted while he goes kill Elliot. It's interesting, too, because that led to an interesting conversation between Larry and Elliot, because Larry's kind of like hero. He doesn't like that title because it's kind of like a title that people kind of put on you. For him, it's like he tried to be a hero, and basically being a hero basically destroyed his entire life. To me, feeding into that whole torture thing that the creature's talking about. But on top of all of that, like, he ends up telling Elliot that he's kind of lucky because he's learning this lesson ahead of time, that basically you can't follow and be what other people want you to be. You have to be true to yourself. And it's like, for him, it's like, it took me a lifetime to learn that lesson. And initially, Elliot was kind of all about killing himself, because he thought like, hey, maybe the fact of the matter is this way I can save the world, or I can just give in and just let them kill me anyway and be done with all this. But it actually took Rita talking to him. It's interesting that out of anyone, the one who seemed like she has the biggest reluctance to all of this ended up being the one to kind of save the day in that regard. I even love it later on when she's like, the fact of the matter is I did a good thing and you're ruining it, because he's like, oh, I don't want to die, and he's kind of being all melancholy because he thinks everything's gonna be over. She's like, so shut up and pick up the fucking beads. It's like, dude, I love that, just because it's like, also too, it's interesting, like her stopping Kip. I believe that's the first time so far in the show she's actually gone out of her way to actually use her powers, as Elastic Girl. Because like usually it's just kind of like she's stressed out and her powers kind of kick in and she tries to keep them under control. But I think this is the first time she's ever actively used her own powers. Whether it was like purposely on purpose, but it was a controlled thing. So that makes me kind of think it was on purpose. Like, I think she kind of like found some resolve, and it kind of gave her the boost she needed to kind of, the kick in the tail to kind of do needed to be done, because, hey, I'm not a hero, but at the very least, we're going to try to save you, There's also that interesting thing about Jane, I thought was kind of interesting, where basically she went off on that priest at the church and everything. It's like, oh, you let all of them down, you hurt her. Like, essentially, it seems like that might be connected to the real Jane, or Kay, if that's potentially who, like, the real Jane is. But nevertheless, I assume it had something to do with that. But, like, Fook was kind of like, it was about some mad scientists experimenting on her. Like, that kind of whole thing came up last episode. So it's like, what does a priest have to do with that too? Was he part of that as well? Was he the one that led her in and then gave her to the scientists to experiment on potentially? Who knows? There's a lot to Jane we still haven't figured it out. So I'm curious to find out about that. But I also love we got introduced to another personality, Penny. And I love that, like, Cliff gets so pissed because like, literally, we're stuck in Nurnheim. And I can't even yell at Hammerhead. He was getting so pissed, and she's so timid and everything. He's like, okay, you ready to fight, Penny? She's, yes, sir. And she walks over and just stands by you. He's like, really? You know what? You guys pissed me off and this and that. And then he gets shocked and he's like, Nurnheim sucks. And so ends up meeting the mother and father. I love that even when they get their reward, the father's there, but he's dead, still with his throat slit and everything. It's interesting, kind of that whole situation that the Arkans kind of explain. Like, once again, how they see themselves, how they see each other. Like the whole Jane seeing him as a monster, and he sees Jane as Clara. He's like, no, I don't see her as my daughter. It's like, yeah, you do. And I think that's what affected Jane so much, is because, once again, I think this kind of ties into what I was bringing up before. Like, obviously some stuff went down with Jane, and for her, she let her guard down, thinking like, oh, Cliff's a good dude. But seeing him covered in blood like that made her think like, oh, this is another person that's lied to me. They're hiding who they really were. They draw me in, and then they show their true colors. Once again, that makes me think maybe that is kind of going with like the whole father or priest situation, kind of luring her in and like, oh yeah, like, I've got your back, I've got your best wishes in hand, and then kind of toss her to the side to be someone's experiment. Potentially, we'll have to wait and see in that regard, but still. But like I said, it was interesting too, because even buried beneath all those personalities and stuff, the Archon, I mean, I guess like they got powers, and now this was their reward for keeping the books so safe and happy for all these years, for as long as it took for the book to be completely written. What's the whole interesting thing of, like I said, being able to see the real person underneath Jane being like this, hurt and scared girl Kay. So that was interesting. I wonder, is that something anyone's ever seen? Like I said, like, I feel like all the personalities have been, shielded around her for so long that I think she's so deep in the underground that you won't be able to kind of get to her. She might not even come out at all. So, which also begs the question, like, I guess, like, the Jane that you kind of know as kind of neutral Jane, I guess maybe she's supposed to be like the last defense mechanism for Kay, of like, oh, this is going to be the me that I show the world, because that girl who's too scared and, who was betrayed and hurt, is kind of potentially like, almost in like a fetal position somewhere buried in the underground. Like, all of these personalities are her last line of defense. I thought it was kind of pretty neat when the Archon was showing them things, and like Jane's looking in the reflections and she sees all the different like personalities being reflected in the shards. I thought that was kind of pretty neat. It does seem like, hey, we are heading towards the end of the world, just because the eye ends up opening in the sky. It's so interesting, many different things. One, I'm actually surprised, because I was kind of feeling like, oh, is this all going to just simply focus on getting toward Mr. Nobody and Chief? But it's like, no, it seems like we're going to have other villains along the way. Like, they might be stepping stones to that, because I think this is also about building up the team, because they're not heroes, but there's ragtag team of misfits is going to find their way. I use that a lot lately with superhero stuff, because like a lot of superhero stuff has that misfits thing, but I think it's also because of the show Misfits. I always refer to everything kind of as misfits, because I feel like if it wasn't for that show, I wouldn't use the term misfits as much as I do. That's just how I am. That's what I think about. But nevertheless, like a tangent. But I think it's going to obviously be building them up to become this makeshift team of heroes who was there to save the day against Mr. Nobody. Maybe this is all connected, maybe it's not. What's really interesting was Cliff did keep bringing up, it's like, is Nerdheim look familiar to you? Like this and that. But then, lo and behold, we look in a house and it's in a globe. I mean, not a snow globe. And it's like, oh, that's why it looks so familiar to Cliff. So it's like, is this not actually Nerdheim? I mean, I guess, dimensions can manifest themselves in different ways. Or is it supposed to be Nerdheim, but really it's just, maybe the Archon think like, oh, we're in Nerdheim, this is our place to rule and stuff like that, but you got this small little globe. You don't realize that you're in some small place to kind of let you rule, do your own thing, but truth be told, it's insignificant. I'm guessing that's what that's supposed to represent. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I'm very interested to see where all of this takes us going forward into the next episode, as we are apparently bracing for the apocalypse. Wasn't expecting it this early in the season, so that's really interesting. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Till the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and good